What's up, interpreters? It's Katie Shea, NAI board member.
What's up, interpreters? This is Heather Manier, your Corporate Engagement and Partnerships Manager at NAI.
What's up, interpreters? This is Emily McCowan, your Visual Branding Specialist at NAI.
Well, thanks, Katie Shea, for being here today. I mean, it's sort of fairly recently come into the sphere of NAI. And it seems to me, and I apologize if that's not true, and you've sort of been around NAI for longer, but certainly with me, I've just recently got to know you. And part of that is because you've recently become the liaison for the young professionals on the board of directors. So you're sitting on our board of directors now. And I know you have, can you talk a little bit about kind of who you are? And I know that your culture is very important to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Katie?
No, of course, and thank you all for having me on today. It's definitely an interesting story, as my husband would compare me to often like a Forrest Gump type, like different chapters in my life. But I would say a lot of this actually began with me participating in a leadership program my tribe puts on every summer for college students. And we did a lot of work and spent a lot of time in our Tribal Cultural Heritage Center. And there we learned our language, we learned just the culture and heritage of our tribe, and got to interact with the tribal roles department, and really spend a lot of time in the Heritage Center with the exhibits and doing like the interpretive component of it. And especially with every year we do a family heritage festival. A lot of folks kind of know it as a powwow, but we just say like family festival. And at that time of year, we have a huge influx of people that visit the Heritage Center. And so that was one of my first experiences of realizing like, oh, I can do something like this for a living. I love teaching about culture. I love being in museums. I don't want to say I'm a nerd, but I am kind of a nerd for this type of environment. And down the road, it was kind of like a planting of a seed, and it inspired me to do an internship with the National Museum of the American Indian, which is commonly known as one of the Smithsonian museums. And so there I got to do kind of a continuation of that work and talk about the culture and heritage of tribes, and then go from that to talk about different artifacts and what it means. They're not just objects that are housed in a museum. These are like cultural items that convey our culture and meaning, medicinal practices, how we relate to the world and relate to the environment and one another. And it was really after that experience, at the concluding of that internship, they're like, hey, there's this really good opportunity. There's this organization called NAI, and they do these awesome like workshops, and you kind of learn what it is to be an interpreter, and kind of like a training, if you will. And we'll be happy to like put you up like for this workshop. It's going to be hosted at the NMAI. And I think it was 2 or 3 Junes ago. It was a while back, but not too long ago. And so I was awesome. Like I was just so, I wouldn't even know how to describe it, but the feeling was just this awesome experience of not only going back to the NMAI and seeing all the folks that I got to work with and spend a lot of time with, but learn more about just the art of interpretation. I truly do believe it is an art. It reminds me a lot of the cultural components that I feel like ring true in my own life of it's an art. Oratory is a very, not only a skill, but a very special knack that we have in our culture for conveying traditional life ways, funny stories of just basically telling you what to do, what not to do, like anything of that nature. And so I really stuck with that. And so I think with the organization, after a while, with going to law school and kind of like taking a break from the field and just focusing on my education, it wasn't really until I did work with the Park Service last year, when I was at Redwood National Park, that I really wanted to get more involved with NAI, doing a lot of work in collections and working with the tribes themselves and hearing these stories. I was like, there's a lot of aspects of interpretation that are wonderful, but there's also not intentional, sometimes intentional, like exclusionary effects of interpretation. We often tell or hear one side of the story, and don't really think of other people's perspectives of how the story ought to be told, or even what time of year to tell a story. And so these types of considerations is actually what inspired me to get more involved in the capacity of being a board member. So in a long story, like that's just kind of like a whole Katie's story arc of my involvement with interpretation and how I came to the organization and my involvement now.
Katie, can you talk about a little bit more of being a member of your tribe and a little bit of the background in that?
No, of course. I would say one thing, and it was awesome to actually talk about this in one of our previous webinars about like Indigenous peoples and interpretation. There's a common misconception that when you are a tribal member, like you automatically know your language and everything. It's almost like this a general blanket assumption as you grow up, like in our society. And for me, I've always known that I was Potawatomi. So like my tribe, I should back up a little bit. My Potawatomi name is Nagumkwe, which means middle of the lake woman. I can explain a little bit of the story behind that later. In my tribe, I'm citizen Potawatomi of Shawnee, Oklahoma, but our homelands are in the Great Lakes. And a lot of this I kind of knew as a young person through my grandmother, and her and my family had always talked about, like we're Potawatomi and you should really get involved with the tribe as you get older. From my understanding, our tribe didn't have a lot of resources that you would think of or see today with like a heritage center or like all these different ways you can like physically go and meet with people and learn about these things until recent years, thanks to our chairman and his economic development knack. But so a lot of it for me was a learning journey that didn't necessarily take place until I was in college. And so a lot of folks, when you think of as someone that's a tribal citizen, people, like I said, often assume you know everything, or they typically think of someone that grew up on a reservation that is brought up in that culture. And so for me, it's always been a unique experience growing up in rural North Texas, always knowing of my tribe in Oklahoma, but never having the opportunity to learn the culture, learn the skills. But then furthermore, which led me to where I'm at today in my work capacity, talking about the sovereignty that tribes inherently have and what that relationship looks like with not only the government, but different departments and agencies such as the National Park Service, which is pretty much what I closely work with today. Um, so it's a unique relationship. I feel like I often like that. I wouldn't say it's a common phrase, but it is a common phrase if you have your foot in two worlds. As I've gotten older, I feel like my worldview's changed quite a bit on things from how I perceive work and do work to like personal beliefs, how I view myself in the world and view others in the world, how we interact with one another, and just trying to live in a world that's full of reciprocity and not, basically giving more than you take, I guess you can say. But I would say, if anything, with my tribal, just being a tribal citizen and my experience of being involved, that's like the biggest community I've ever felt support in. And from there, that's really informed my experience and inspired me of like how I want to leave my mark on the world. Before, I had always wanted to be a teacher, but then after my experience of the leadership program, I knew what I wanted to teach about. I always had this passion for history, and so after that program, I naturally was like, oh, this is like a history. I feel like a lot of us have that shared experience of when we have that attachment to something or connection in our personal life, we just feel drawn to like speak to that and teach people about that. It's like our flow state. That's what we're most passionate about. And so after that experience, not only did I want to learn more about it, because there's just so many different buckets of information you can like focus on, um, but then also just teach people about. And so it's interesting. I feel like it's almost an obligation to teach about it as a tribal citizen, but really it's just something that you get to cherish and enjoy as well. So many different things to talk about, but that's kind of like some of the first things that come to mind as being a tribal citizen.
Thanks for sharing that with us, Katie. I know that's some personal information, but I think it is really important. I mean, because you're not only sharing that information with people who might not be as familiar with Indigenous people in America specifically, but also Indigenous people, right? You're sharing that with, like you said, you didn't get involved in your tribe until college. And I guess you were lucky, right? To be able to have your grandmother to talk to you about that, and kind of keep you connected in that way to Potawatomi, right? Is that I say that
Oh,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, um, so thank you for that. And again, thanks for sharing. I did want to just, it's just like a little question that I had. Is powwow a bad term? Is it a negative? Does it have negative connotation?
So I would say in the sense that it's sometimes they're often used like say in a work environment, like, oh, let's powwow about this. That I would say, and I can't speak for all folks because I know there's some areas of language where there is a sense of reclamation. Like I know some folks reclaim the word Indian and they even use slang like capital I, capital D, capital N, like Indian, or sorry, capital N, capital D, capital N. So there's some areas where it's that sense of reclaiming the power of that word and using it in the slang or the sense they want to give the power to. But in my sense, especially in my work environment, working with the park system, I always steer away and just educate like, hey, this is powwows are actually think of them as family festivals. It's typically a very significant time of year for people to come together and celebrate their heritage, celebrate their ancestors, but also a political sense of when chairmen or chairwomen are elected or like serious meetings are coming together. Because traditionally, with how tribes were very nomadic, this is a time of year where people would all come together from the different bands or like travel great distances. Even intertribally, people would come together, and that's when they talk about almost like diplomats or when delegates come together, they talk about some serious issues about governance or peacemaking, and then also the cultural sense of celebrating and dancing and feasting. And especially with the sense, anytime you talk about this, here we are, another layer of the issue, um, whether it be the allotment era or the assimilation era, a big thing that kind of changed the trajectory of this and kind of gave it a bad power of using that term is um, powwows would often overlap with harvesting season. And so a huge part of trying to take power away from tribes to steer them towards the quote American way of life is actually passing laws saying, hey, you can't do this cultural dance. You can't come together and do ceremony. You're supposed to be doing your harvest. You're supposed to be going to church. You're supposed to be doing this because the allotment era, among like other initiatives the government among tribes had to try to do and infiltrate, is taking them away from their culture through laws and oppression. And so a lot of folks might say, oh, it's just a word. But when you think of the irony sense, much like mascots and all of this, it's like, well, you tell us and you oppress us against these values to go towards your values. But then decades down the road, it's okay for you to use them without recourse. And so in a long-winded response, like I have multiple feelings about it, but I definitely always encourage folks like, hey, maybe if you're not referring to the actual family festival that you go and participate in, maybe not use that word. It's not really appropriate.
Katie, what is your new job title? Did you mention that or?
Oh,
Okay.
no, I haven't. So I previously was contracting with the National Park Service. I did like a series of internships with them, but now in May, I started working with the National Parks Conservation Association. And how I love to describe it, a lot of folks commonly think of these two non-profit kind of like arms, like counterparts of the Park Service. The most common one that comes to mind is the National Park Foundation. You see them in the Subaru commercials. When you go to park units, you see them like in the gift shop, like oh, donate here. It's like Park Foundation. So they're the more philanthropic arm. But with my organization, we're more of like the lobbying advocacy arm, I guess you can say. With agencies, if there's any issue that needs an act of Congress, they can't advocate for themselves. So that's why NPCA was essentially created, was to advocate for those issues. But then on top of that, help establish national parks or national monuments. I know I'm only about 3 months on, so it's still no excuse, but I'm still learning a lot about some of our role and what we've done. But I know we've had involvement with Katmai being established, Everglades. Um, I'm trying to think what else. But in my role specifically, I am the inaugural Tribal Co-Management Policy Fellow. So it's a very interesting, I feel like I'm like in this dance, or not, I wouldn't even say a limbo, but I'm in this dance because we talk about a legacy that's often fraught with park services, land and like the relationship they share with tribes. And so with the National Parks Conservation Association, we support but also challenge the national park system to fulfill and uphold its mission and hold them to their mission. And so with my role, it's kind of treading new waters of the co-management space or the shared stewardship strategy that's really it's been a thing, I would say arguably since the 70s, but it's become more mainstream with this current administration saying, hey, you have these rights and obligations that you have to fulfill in the federal trust responsibility to tribes. Because a lot of folks don't realize the national parks, that's federal trust land, and federal trust land was land that came from tribes through treaties or ceded lands. And so a lot of these spaces actually still have either treaty rights or reserved rights, which I have to enumerate. These are rights tribes reserved to themselves and for themselves. They were not rights granted by the United States, but rather rights tribes granted to the United States in this exchange. So my role is basically educating on this and then also working to deepen current relationships we have with tribes, but then also build relationships through providing support with my legal, like my policy background and technical assistance to go through this process of what is co-management, or how do I make an agreement, or hey, this park is ignoring me and like they're not acknowledging our rights, like we need support on this. And so I'm kind of the squeaky wheel in the organization, I guess you can say.
When we were talking about setting this interview up, you had mentioned that you were going to go provide legal support to a group of tribes. And so
Hmm.
you talk about as much detail, as little detail or more detail that you want, sort of what's that like and the impact of it?
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, where do I start on this? So the interesting thing about my fellowship, I'll start there. It is essentially there's this need. It's like NPCA is really relationship driven. We want to organically take steps in ways like our relationship evolves and like recognizing need and trying to fulfill need or a gap. And so there's existing relationships with the Native American Rights Fund, which they're kind of like the NAACP, like just one of the biggest legal firms for not just civil rights issues, but like specific policy areas. And so with NARF, Native American Rights Fund, there's a lot of issues with support of their clients with kind of like public lands and land planning type of stuff with co-management. And it's almost like these different organizations had come together to either provide grants or some sort of technical assistance for tribes trying to enter into co-management agreements or facilitating it. And so NPCA and NARF kind of created this bridging mechanism, like a partnership, if you will. And so I'm the fellowship for NPCA, and then there's a fellow for the Native American Rights Fund, and us together are working on like projects that support these different initiatives, like whether it be an actual document we're creating that's kind of like a textbook, that's like a how-to agreement guide, like building an actual agreement, to workshopping these ideas. And so 50% of my work is that. The other 50% of my work is internal ops, basically teaching people within NPCA, like, hey, these are tribes. This is how we engage with them. Like, they are sovereign entities. They're not just some community stakeholder. Like, it's much more than they're rights holders, not stakeholders. Very important discernment there. But anyway, so backpedaling here, with some of the things that I do, it's not just the educational component. It's being able to sit down and help provide like practical solutions with not just teaching about like, hey, what's co-management? We have a lot of scholarship that talks about that now. Now it is showing, kind of helping facilitate walking through like how to actually build an agreement. There's several tribes that have a lot of experience in agreement making when it comes to say like the Park Service. And of course, it's like my biggest agency I work with, but in this case, the language is so new and the mechanisms, there's already existing authorities that facilitate co-management and co-stewardship. There just hasn't been a lot of recognition. And so here I'm using my legal background in federal Indian policy to say, hey, like this is how you can build an agreement, and we'll walk you through like some sample provisional languages that have already been used in existing agreements, and you're kind of just piecemealing this together. And so what we've done in this partnership is I'm essentially in a way supporting the folks at NARF that have all of, like some of the brightest minds in the country, and which is a huge honor for me. I will never be thankful enough for this opportunity. I'm still pinching myself some days that I get to work with NARF in this capacity, but there's opportunities where we'll go to conferences, or in this case, 2 weeks ago, I went to Denver, and there's a group of tribes that came together because they're grantees for the First Nations Development Institute to kind of support their work and co-management. And so this was a workshop that basically provided this cohort a space to come together and not only share their own experiences, because need I remind you, I mean, tribes, a lot of these individuals that are leaders in these different roles have decades of just phenomenal experience, wealth of knowledge. And so half the time you can even step back and they can learn from each other. They don't really need me. And so in this space, it's not only a space for them to come together, but for us to provide any additional assistance they might need. It might be something as technical as, hey, like I am interested in 638 contracting. What can you tell me about that? And I'm like, oh, I'm glad you asked. Let's go through the Indian Self-Determination Education and Assistance Act, or the nickname 638, and talk about contracting versus compacting. So it's very, I guess you can say, technical assistance on just these legal questions that some, might not know the answer to. Because even with Google, and this is where I challenge AI, you can Google something free language and you still don't get what you actually need, like the substance of like this legal question you need an answer to. So that's like a little bit about like the nitty gritty of what I do, but I kind of have 10 jobs in one. I wouldn't say it's fun, but it's interesting. It's interesting.
It's interesting that AI has not caught up with everything, right? Because that's not an algorithm that AI knows yet when you're talking about what did you call it? 836, or what was the number?
Oh yeah, the 638. Yeah.
638, thank you. We have to get back to interpretation at some point, but I have a couple of questions. One, I wonder if it helps having Deb Holland in the role that she's in, like as far as your work. And then I also wonder, when you're talking about these agreements, I mean, is there still mistrust? Because so many agreements through the years have just been ignored, right? And so I just find your role very fascinating and important, and obviously the role that NARF is playing too. But I just kind of wonder the environment and kind of the temperature of these meetings when in the past there has been so much disrespect and suppression.
Oh, certainly. I know that people can't see me, but I'm nodding my head yes. And also behind me on my wall is a letter from Secretary Holland. And she is like, I'm trying not to get emotional, but she is just so influential for not only the work that I do, but even in co-management. And this is where I can really tie my passion for interpretation. In years past, with the 638 mechanism, there is an opportunity for tribes to reclaim kind of like a level of control over, say, for instance, like an archaeological program, like doing an archaeological like field school or tribal monitoring. But now that's expanded to even do education and interpretation. We see a huge influx of tribes kind of taking that control and the funding over to manage visitor centers in the Park Service. Like there's an upcoming grand opening for Katahdin Woods and Waters, a visitor center, like that's the first of its kind really in Maine, that was not only designed by a consortia of tribes, but it was an interplan and the layout of the museum, what's on exhibit, like the actual structure, like the architectural design of the museum. It's like work that she's done and really pushing the narrative for shared stewardship. People often think of lands planning, but that's also working on the bison management plan. And for me, like my specialty with museum studies and cultural heritage is saying like, hey, like we want to share our story in the way we want it to be told, which is extremely influential with the 250th of America coming up in 2026. And I like to challenge that America 250 narrative of saying, hey, this is not the starting of America's history. This is really its next leg of American history, because we've been here. We've been here, baby. This is like Indigenous America 250 plus, this is really when nations were coming together. And so with these agreements, there's definitely a lot of mistrust. I mean, you're talking about, like, say, for instance, a landmark case that just came down a couple of years ago, McGirt v. Oklahoma. It started with, like, at the end of the Trail of Tears, there's a promise. But essentially that those promises have been broken for just so many years, whether it be treaties or agreements. And so this is really an opportunity for relationship building that I've seen in the Park Service. And, it's not just the Park Service, there's Fish and Wildlife, there's Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation. I mean, there's just so many different agencies and departments. It's a lot of work that's been happening. And so to be alive in this time, like pretty much after graduating law school and going down the chute, and Secretary Holland being the first Secretary of Interior that was Native, I'm like, holy cow, like I feel like there's so many stars aligning, and it's just so influential in interpretation, because it's not just these agreements, it's giving tribes that power back to say, hey, like, not only have you been able to have this right to resume funding to operate and manage these programs, but we're expanding them to not only be merely a monitor in archaeology. You can run this interpretive program. You can tell people, like, hey, this sign's outdated and inappropriate. We need to redo it. This exhibit, these things should not be on exhibit. We need to redo this, and we need to be consulted first. So it's interesting because there's just so many ways interpretation actually plays a major role in this, in my opinion.
Katie, on this latest issue of Legacy Magazine, the July-August issue, it was interpreting for the first time. You were a guest editor on this. Can you talk about sort of how you felt connected to this theme and the experience of being guest editor?
Definitely. I think that was one of my most cherished and memorable experiences to date, like in anything I've done, like work, non-work related. I feel like oftentimes in this role I play as not only being like kind of like this liaison for like young professional like counsel, like young professional like board member. I think when you get your start in your career, you often feel like imposter syndrome, or you think a lot of people already think of things you're thinking of. So when you want to share your story, you might feel like it's overcasted because it's, like, oh, it's been talked about a lot, or people might feel differently than you. And so really having this coming together, and not only having people that are like contributing to legacy for the first time, but in that same token, sharing their stories of, whether it be revelations they've had in the field of interpretation, they're coming to it and they're like relatively new to the discipline or like the field at large. There's just so many different like aspects that just really spoke to me. And there's some things I just kind of fall into, and it truly was a privilege just to be not only asked and like invited to be the guest editor, but to kind of curate all these different stories. I mean, it truly was a treat to hear people's different experiences in life, and there was truly a through line of these experiences that people just are hungry to build community, and just that desire to connect and spark like passions in people, and educate about like their connections that they have. I mean, that's what got me into this business, I guess you can say. I'm just always wanting to teach and learn. I'm hungry for it. And so it was a remarkable experience. I don't know what else I could say other than that.
That's awesome. Well, another way that you are participating and play a big role in NAI is the young professional seat on the board, and your liaison to the Young Professional Council. You have so much going on. We could hear that in everything you've just talked about. I guess I'm kind of curious what the motivation was for you being on the board in this role.
I ask myself that a lot because there's sometimes I say yes to so much. I'm like, Katie, remember the why, remember the why. And for me, I was really like stuck between the two. I remember like yesterday when I was going through this, like I had a couple of folks that reached out to me because I was at Redwood at the time. I was in the field. I had like no Wi-Fi. So I remember one day I came in, I had like 4 or 5 people email me, and they're like, hey, there's like some board positions open. Like you should really like think about it. And I was like, okay, okay. Because at that point, I kind of thought I was stepping away from interpretation. I was doing more like collections, archival work, and working on like policy, like nerdy stuff, right? And so I was like, I still love and still very much think of myself as an interpreter, but they had another position or like focus where it was kind of like an underrepresented like community like type role. and the young professional role. And I was like, in a way, I feel like it's really my both, and it shouldn't be about labels, but I'm always about encouraging, like, not only camaraderie, but just building confidence and community, and always like creating space for other people and just encouraging them to, like, hey, like, come try this out, or like, hey, like, you might be new to this, and you might consider yourself as a young professional and you don't know a lot, but that's just imposter syndrome. Like, you are here, like, the first step is just showing up, and that speaks a lot to what, you're doing and your passion, but really it's just this desire to share kind of what I was working on in interpretation in my own unique way, and then bring it to the board, because there's sometimes I feel like there's a lot of gap in ages too. And so when you think of leadership, you really want it to reflect some of the needs of that core group in an organization. And I mean, talk about a lot going on. Like, I just got confirmed to be a board member for the American Conservation Experience. And my work is not focused on alumni work, but they specifically wanted an alumni in that experience. So it's kind of like the same motive, right? Hey, like, I see this opportunity, and there's a lot of kind of gaps that I see, and I really want to step in and say, hey, like, not only do I want to learn about the roles and responsibilities a board member would have. I mean, that's really great professional development, no matter what you do, administratively, financially. But I also want to speak to the higher need of what we experience, because our organization truly is experiencing a lot of change. I mean, albeit gradually, but there's been a lot of interesting things I've seen just in the last 6 months of not just being a board member, but like a participant in NAI. It's been a wild ride. It's been fun though.
Well, if none of the staff or anybody else from NAI has thanked you, I do thank you for taking on this role, because it is very important, and you've already done so much already, but it's just, you have such an important perspective that we really appreciate you.
Yeah, Katie, you talking about the why, I can tell you, even just seeing the things that you do as a young professional, like, you inspire me because you do so much, and it makes me feel like, well, I could do that too. And so that's just another reason, like, you're kind of not just doing it for yourself. You are such an inspiration for young professionals, and I'm so excited for you to be on the board and the impact that you'll have for us.
Oh, thank you. Don't be getting me tearing up or get the big head over here, but it truly is a thankless job and a role, because oftentimes I reflect back on my own journey, and there's so many people that just like just their presence in my life and who they were just kind of screamed the why. It was like this, like, blinking arrow of like this direction I needed to go down. And there's so often, especially in the work that I do, given it is very niche, there's often times where there isn't a path. And so there are people that kind of have to shake things up and be like, you know what, we need to kind of broaden our horizons here and think creatively. One of my own heroes or mentors, I think of John Echo Hawk, and of course, this is very specific to like Native policy and just like civil rights, but he was one of the first Native people to go and get a legal education, and he was one of the founders of the Native American Rights Fund, and he's still, very involved. He's in that office every single day. He's been there 50 plus years. And I think of what he did for so many, much like other folks in different communities have done. And so when I think of our role in interpretation, there's so many stories to be told, right? Like, I know my background's in Native studies and that discipline, right? But even if it's about something with more like the natural side of the discipline of ed and interp, or something that's more STEM, like, you always need someone to kind of like open up that little path, or just plant that seed and be like, oh, you know what? I can do this. Like, I want to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, you're like the epitome of affecting change too, right? Like, in order to get something out of something, you've got to participate. I talk to people a lot about this with NAI. It's a good association where you really can affect change. It's still a grassroots organization, I think, because we do have all these communities, geographically and then subject matter focused. Participation is key. So thank you for bringing that up.
Katie, thank you so much for joining Heather and I today. It has been a wonderful conversation with you. And again, we really thank you for the work that you're doing for our organization, and can't wait to see what you do in the future.
Such a pleasure to not only be invited to participate today and just kind of tell my story, but to be involved in an organization that has such a huge place in my heart. So thank you both for your time, for listening to me just flap my gums.
And
And interpreters, that's what's up.
Yeah.